same for you, Alice? Because I only have yours on Kindle.
We're good.
We're good.
We're good.
Okay, thank you for coming to the Word Vancouver panel, Complex Relationships. And of course, we have a complex relationship as with this land that we are on, as we welcome you to the traditional homelands of unceded territories by the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, and I will also say Kikite First Nations, New Westminster. Mm-hmm. So my name is Todd Wong. I'm your moderator. We have Janie Chang, author of Porcelain Moon. We have Hiro Kanagawa, playwright and author of Forgiveness, adapted from the book, Mark Sakamoto's book. You were just on panel with them.
Mm-hmm.
And we have Alice Poon and the Heavenly Sword. This is part of a series, isn't it, Alice?
Yeah, it's a duology.
A duology. Is there going to be a trilogy? Maybe.
Nope, not. It's a duology. Book 2 is coming out.
Okay.
Next year.
So earlier we were actually talking about what we're going to say and if we have a reading or are we going to have questions. And I think we're just going to give each author a chance to speak about some of the characters that are in the book because they're so interesting. I've been reading the books. Janie's book is historical fiction. And initially what we find when we open up is that there are Chinese people living in France during World War I. And if people didn't know, Chinese laborers were brought over to France to dig trenches and different things. And so it's an interesting thing about how people fall in love in a different country. Is it complex or complicated? Hiro's book, Forgiveness, if you didn't see the play at the Arts Club earlier this year, it's based on Mark Sakamoto's memoir, Forgiveness. He won Canada Reads.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anything for you to win, was there?
It has won a couple of awards since then.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I love the play, and it's actually happens with two simultaneous stories. A white Canadian in Hong Kong gets captured and sent to Japanese soldiers are running the prison of war camp, but it's also mirroring Japanese Canadians in Canada, in Vancouver and Richmond, who get put into internment camps by their own government. Heavenly Sword, Alice has written this in the style of wuxia. Did I pronounce it?
Yes.
Which is the Chinese martial arts movies. And usually you see, how many people saw Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon? Lots of people like that, but she's written her own novel. It's a love story because a goddess comes down to earth as a human and falls in love and has a whole bunch of mysterious things happening. And as I said to her, I'm more familiar with the goddess of mercy in Chinese mythology, who as a human, as a Chinese male general, ascends to heaven and becomes a goddess. So lots of things are happening. So who would like to start first? Tell us about your characters. Or the book.
Start.
Okay, Janie.
I'll start with a short summary of the book and how the idea came about, which is that when you write historical fiction and you're researching for one book, chances are you'll come across a nugget that inspires you for another one. And for me, it was coming across mention of the city of Liverpool that was putting up a monument to honor the 140,000 Chinese workers who were sent to work in Europe on the Western Front for the Allies in World War I. And of course, I thought, what 140,000 Chinese workers sent to work, at the Western Front? And from there on, the research started, and I thought it was just a really fascinating chapter of history that was forgotten for almost 100 years, that so many people could have been sort of swept under the carpet of the historical record, so to speak. And I knew I wanted to write a story about that, about how they were recruited by the Allies from northern China to go and work in France and England, because basically the French and British were decimated after the slaughters of the Somme and Verdun. They were just running out of manpower. So they needed to bring in foreigners. And they brought in other foreign labor, but the Chinese were the largest and the longest serving contingent. And if you think about what how battles are won, it's actually not very Hollywood at all. There's heroics, but behind it there's the whole supply chain of the logistics of making sure that there's ammunition and fuel and medicine that can get transported to the front lines in time so that battle can commence. And that was what these Chinese workers did. And that was a wonderful starting point for history. But if you're going to have a story, you have to have relationships, because relationships are what keep an audience's interest. And the strongest relationships and the most compelling ones are that of family, I find, anyway. So in this particular story, there is a young woman, a Chinese woman named Pauline Dang, and she has been living in France. She's orphaned, and she lives with her uncle, who runs a antiques shop in Paris. And he's about to marry her off, but before he can do that, she runs away to the Western Front to find her cousin, Theo, who is working for the Chinese Labor Corps as a translator. And while she is there, she has no place to stay while searching for her cousin. And she runs into a young woman named Camille, who is very kind to her, offers her a place to stay. And then we discover what the relationship is between Pauline and Camille and Theo. So that is sort of the essential. It's a triangle, but not your typical love triangle at all. So I would say the complex relationship, although there are a number of complicated relationships in this book, is the friendship that starts with Camille and Pauline, a young French woman, Camille, who's in an abusive relationship, and Pauline, a Chinese woman who has been raised in France and does not want to go back to China, and how their friendship begins, and then they sort of distance from each other, and then they find out how they really are, how their lives are really intertwined, and they are forced into doing something together that binds them for life. That is my complex relationship.
It's kind of neat because initially when I was reading it, it's like her uncle or her family wants to set her up in an arranged marriage and send her back to China, but she doesn't want to go. Thank you, Janie.
You know what? Before I talk about forgiveness, I'm just going to riff off of what some of the things that you said that resonated with me, because I think that, being part of the Asian diaspora, and because most of the history that I learned in Canada and in the US as well, because for much of my lifetime, that history tended to be Eurocentric. There are all of these neglected histories of, Chinese people digging trenches during World War. And it reminds me that I think when 1917 that epic film 1917 came out, one of the criticisms was that there were no South Asian people in that movie, or there was like one South Asian person in that movie, when historically, in fact, something like 1 of 7 people who fought for the British in World War I was of South Asian origin, And I'm working on a story now about a group of about 200 Japanese Canadians who wanted to enlist and fight for Canada in World War I for the British, but were refused. They weren't allowed to. They wanted to fight as a means to gain citizenship and the franchise, but BC wouldn't allow them to. So they went to Calgary. They went to Alberta on their own dime and signed up with the 10th Battalion and actually fought for the British that way, and then came back to Canada and still were refused.
And that was for World War I.
World War I. That was
so if you go to Stanley Park, you can go. There's a monument there to the Japanese Canadian soldiers who fought
That's
for
right. Mhm.
us in World War One. And the terrible thing is, during World War Two, people wanted to tear it down. So
Yeah.
it's amazing. And have you also, just to riff on this, have you gone to the monument for Remembrance Day, because the Japanese Canadian community goes there?
Yes. There are many. There were many decorated soldiers who came back and still were not, given citizenship in the franchise in BC until 1931 is when they finally won it, and then only to in World War II
Yeah.
turn around and have their property confiscated and sent to concentration camps. So. It's fascinating when that there are so many stories that have been overlooked throughout history, right? And so, getting to forgiveness, forgiveness too is an astonishing true history of Mark Sakamoto's grandparents. Um, his grandfather on his mother's side, Ralph McLean, was a Canadian soldier in World War II. He enlisted at the age of 17, a year young. But he was sent with the Royal Rifles of Canada to Hong Kong. And on the eve of, basically, at the same time that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, they also attacked Hong Kong. And in the Battle of Hong Kong, the Canadian soldiers there, who were the first Canadian casualties in World War II, both the Royal Rifles and the Winnipeg Grenadiers were decimated, and the survivors were captured and spent the remainder of the war suffering tremendous cruelty and deprivation at the hands of the Japanese in Japanese POW camps. So that's Mark Sakamoto's grandfather. His grandmother, Mitsue Sakamoto, was a Japanese Canadian girl living in a fishing community called Celtic Cannery, which today is the Southlands of Vancouver on the Fraser River there. And of course, when World War II broke out, Mitsue and her family were rounded up by the BC government. And one thing about the internment is some families, if they so chose, if they wanted their families to stay together, they could avoid the camps, Tashme and Greenwood and, Lemon Creek. There are all these camps that Slocan that are very well known, but the families who wanted to stay together, they had an option to go to Alberta and work on sugar beet farms and stay together as a family. So that's what the Sakamoto family did. And they spent the duration of the war under rather very trying, horrible conditions, living in a chicken coop on a sugar beet farm near Coaldale, Alberta. And the story of forgiveness is Ralph and Mitsue's experiences during the war, but then after the war, their children, Ralph's daughter Diane and Mitsue's son Stan, fall in love, and really on an emotional level, the story is about how Ralph and Mitsue find the grace and courage in their hearts to forgive those who have wronged them so that their families can move forward, so that Stan and Diane can, get married and build a life together. And I think that it's very much a story that resonates today and during any time because of the race hatred and the social problems that we live with in a multicultural society. So that, in a nutshell, is forgiveness.
Thank you, Hiro. And I saw the play twice, opening night and then one of the final performances. And it was amazing just to watch how everything was staged and interacted. And the two main stories are told at the same time, simultaneously, and going back and forth. But I should mention for our audience as well that they might not just know you as a playwright or author, but you're also an actor
Yes,
and have
I am.
performed in many things.
Yes, I am. But today we'll just we'll talk about free. I just want to add that in relation to the theme of complex relationships, one thing that I think I want to bring into the discussion is that each of us, our relationship to the society that we live in is complex, and I think it's all the more so if you're of non-white descent. My relationship to my own Japanese heritage, my Asianness, has certainly evolved over the course of my lifetime. It's still evolving. And so that makes, and that's very complex. My relationship to Canada, my relationship to Japan, my relationship to the Japanese Canadian community, to the Asian Canadian community. It's a very complex relationship because it's always in flux depending on what's going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of conflict between people who were born and raised in Japan and China, and they came here. But Joy Kogawa, she also consulted with Mark Sakamoto when he was writing. So one of my other hats I wear is being on the board for the historic Joy Kogawa House Society. You've come. Joy said to us, that even though Todd's Chinese, we can still be really good best friends. And I had cousins who were in Hong Kong when Japan invaded. So lots of things to get connected in many different ways.
Mhm.
And so now, Alice, you're going to tell us about gods and goddesses and sword fights.
Yeah. My story is set in a fantastical universe made up of the mortal, immortal, and demonic realms. So it's a story not as serious in theme as Janie's and Hiro's. But anyway, it's a wuxia fantasy. Um, and the novel has themes of social justice, found family bond, fellowship loyalty, loss, and forgiveness. Actually, these themes can readily be found in all of Jin Yong's wuxia novels. Jin Yong is a household name in Chinese communities. He has been dubbed China's Tolkien, and some of his most popular wuxia novels have been released in English, with many more to come. And Jin Yong is certainly my literary hero, and it's due to his inspiration that I wrote this duology. Uh, Let me just take you through the synopsis of the novel. The moon goddess Chang is sent to the mortal world to enable to she's sent to the mortal world in the earthly form of a girl warrior called Tang Sire. Her celestial mission is to bring the tyrant Judy to heel. Judy used to be a sky wolf who pursued Chang before his fall from grace. And Sire is baffled by this spurious past romance, while her mission demands that she give up love in exchange for mastering a deadly martial arts skill. When she and Ma San Bao, a eunuch in Judy's court, fall in love with each other, her resolve to go on with the mission falters. Meanwhile, Judy incites a civil war that threatens to decimate her loved ones and her village people. The story is about how she treads a fine line between losing her loved ones and her dream and accomplishing her mission. In the story, there is a poignant quadrangle relationship that denotes true love, unrequited love, loyalty, jealousy, and treachery. This four-way relationship involves four main characters, and they are Tang Sire, the protagonist, Judy, the antagonist, Tang Bin Hong as Sire's foster brother, and Ma Sanbao as Sire's love interest. In a nutshell, the interplay goes like this. The spurious romance between Tang Sire and Judy happened in their past immortal lives, and it befuddles Sire's present judgment of Judy. From Judy's perspective, all he wants is to put Sire under his thumb because he knows about her mission and fears her martial prowess. Sire and Ma Sanbao truly love each other, but theirs is a tortuous love that is destined to go through a bed of thorns because Judy is insanely jealous of their love and is bent on wrecking it. Tang Bin Hong is secretly infatuated with Sire, but keeps mum about his feelings and hates Ma Sanbo's guts. So this is the four-way relationship, um, and it's kind of convoluted, but it actually acts as a cohesive agent that binds the story together and propels the story forward. Relationships, whether it's friendship, romantic ties, or familial ties, all play a pivotal role in our lives as they provide emotional support, comfort, and sense of well being that we need. On the other hand, our uncongenial traits of behavior and mind may mess up and harm our close relations. The same is true in fiction. Clearly, too, complex character traits will impact deeply on relationships. So, to get a better picture of the quadrangle relationship, it's best to take a look at the evolvement of these four characters' behavioral and mental traits. In Tang Sayer's case, her dual identity as Chang, the moon goddess, and Sire, the village girl, is the most prominent complex trait. It forces her into juggling the demands of her celestial mission and her instinctive human desire for love. By design, she does fall for Ma Sanbao, and her quandary will plague her for most of the narrative. Also, her past immortal romance with Sky Wolf often befuddles her present judgment of Judy, but she soon learns from her mistake and faces the harsh truth. However, Judy still looms large as a bane to her love relation with Ma Sanbao. Other than her love interest, she cares deeply for her father and her two foster brothers, Tang Bin Hong and Dong Yin Ho, and would fight Judy's henchmen to the death for them. Judy has a traumatic past in both his immortal and mortal existences, and he turns out to be a super complex, distrustful, and vengeful villain who is not amenable to uh, owning up to his heinous mistakes. He can't let go of his noxious past and enjoys inflicting hurt on others, even on his submissive servant Ma Sanbao. He regards Sire as a deadly menace and does everything in his power to hound her. In the depth of his soul, though, a soft spot might still be reserved for her. Um, Although still haunted by his tragic childhood, Ma Sanbao stoically fights against his bad memories and tries to adhere to his sense of right and wrong, while his innate kindness and generosity lets him forgive and forget. Being a staunch survivor of mishaps, he remains single mindedly loyal and caring to Sire and imparts his love of life to her that keeps her afloat during dark times. Having lost both parents to unjust persecution, Tang Bin Hong grows up hating court officials. As Sire's foster brother, he, dote, he dotes on her and secretly develops romantic feelings for her. His prejudice prompts him to treat Ma Sanbao with contempt and hostility, but eventually rounds of soul searching and also bad experiences of the Civil War nudge him to grow out of hatred and petty jealousy. As he matures, his infatuation with Sire turns into dedication to her well-being and her cause. So that's it.
Good. Thank you, Alice. So lots of complex relationships with different family members as well as their own personal growth.
Yes.
And so I want to move on to bring Janie back in and say that, Janie, while you were writing this book, I saw lots of pictures. I think you were doing research in France. And your previous book.
I didn't get to do research in France because it was COVID.
Oh,
I actually had a professor friend at the university in Aix-en-Provence find me a grad student to help me do my research, but she didn't manage to go where I needed to go anyway, because the town where the Chinese Labor Corps was headquartered is in northern France. It's called Noyelles-sur-Mer. And she finally got hold of the vice mayor of the town, who said, "You cannot come. Everything is closed. The town hall is closed. The archives are closed." So thank goodness for the internet and for being able to order books online.
yes.
So anyway,
that's
that's
okay.
the
I was going to
research part.
compare you doing research in China for Library of Legends or Three Souls, but I'm wondering if your husband enjoyed going to France more so, because then you just hung out in Paris.
No, so we did go to France, but it was for a holiday. But the thing about research is that it can lead you down so many rabbit holes. And one of the things I was trying to do in building relationships was it plausible for a Chinese person and a Chinese man and a French woman at that time to have a romance? And actually, the research informed me anecdotally that these things did happen. There were interviews with descendants of these biracial marriages. And I also read a very interesting account of a woman who insisted that she wanted to marry her Chinese boyfriend because he did not smoke, he did not spend his money on drink, he did not gamble, and he did not beat women, which I think was kind of a low bar to set. But what it does is, historically, it gives you permission to write a romance between a French woman of the time and a Chinese man of the time, even though it wasn't illegal. France hadn't figured out that any such thing was possible, so they hadn't enacted any laws to make it illegal for a white person to marry a non-white person. But that was a complicated situation, which I think informs on the relationship.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it's interesting because I think reading S.E. Dugan's book, Half-Blood Blues, where she's looking at Black culture in Paris, where the people felt more free. Louis Armstrong, Josephine Baker, because they could be treated as humans and not as second-class citizens in their own country. It makes a big difference. And then a French half Chinese actress is in Guardians of the Galaxy now, which is great. But then I'm thinking, Hiro, as well, how did you feel after working through Mark's book? Because he won Canada Reads, and here you are working through everything. How did you change the story arcs much? Did you embellish or change some of the relationships that were complex or complicated?
Yeah, there's a lot that I had to change, just because, 2.5 hours on stage. We had 13 actors playing, I believe, close to 70 different characters. There were 100 costumes. But even so, I had, in reality, for instance, Mitsue's family consisted of Mitsue. She had two older brothers and a younger sister. I think there were 4 or 5 children in her family. In the play, of course, it's just Mitsue and her brother Pat. She actually spent the war with her husband Hideo's parents, but in the play, she spends the war with her own parents. The Sakamoto family actually never went to Hastings Park because they decided they wanted to go to a beet field in Alberta, so they never had to pass through Hastings Park. But I added that into the story because I felt that any play about the Japanese Canadian experience during World War II, that seminal event ought to be a part of the play. So, those are just a few of the ways in which I had to tweak, change history, change the known history in order to make the play work. That's just logistical stuff. In terms of did I change who people were? Well, that was a trickier thing because most of the people that I was writing about were still alive, or were beloved members of the McLean and Sakamoto family. So, in that sense, no. In that sense, I was bound to, through my conversations with Mark Sakamoto and other members of his family, I had to get a really good sense for myself of who Ralph and Mitsue were, and try to stay true to that emotional core of who they were as human beings. Not to mention, also some of the people that I interviewed were also characters in the play. Mark's dad Stan, his brother Ralph, or his brother Ron, and their sister Glory. They're all in the play, and I didn't have the liberty to just go off and make stuff up about who they were. But thankfully, it all worked out, and I got very few notes from anyone about the depictions of those characters. The one note that stands out is at one point in the play, I had Mitsue Sakamoto telling her husband that she was pregnant. And I got a note from her daughter Glory that her mother would never use that word. She was very proper and reserved. And in those days, the word pregnant was rather crude, right? So crude and direct, and that she would never say that. She would never use the word. So I can't remember how I got around that, but pardon? Expecting. Yeah, that's right. Expecting. She says, Hideo, I'm expecting. Right. Yeah. So, that's just one example. I mean, and it was actually the only example of getting any notes about Mitsue's portrayal. Well, that's not true because, it was made eminently clear to me that no one ever recalled hearing her raise her voice in anger.
And
But of course, in the play, she does because, it's drama and you have to have that. She, given the circumstances, especially.
it was really interesting watching the play and seeing the characters battle between being the nice Asian daughter and being able to stand up for themselves and be Canadian. And that goes back and forth. So different complex characters. And then Ron, of course, being a big promoter of musical acts and bringing the Guess Who to town. And I think in the book it says that he received the what was it? The Canadian Promoter
Music.
Award?
He received the Canadian Music Promoter of the Year award 18 times in a row, and then they wouldn't allow him to get it the 19th time. They said, Ron, you can't win this award anymore, but we're going to name it after you. So now it's called the Ron Sakamoto Award. He's not allowed to win it.
So he's still promoting.
He's still promoting.
Yes, and it was amazing to work that into the play because it seemed so Canadian thing to do, and against this backdrop of such racial hatred and complex relationships.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at when I mentioned how our identities are in flux. Because as a Japanese Canadian, right, and the Sakamoto family is certainly a great example of this. There's cultural inscriptions of who we are or who we're supposed to be, and so we have a relationship to that. That's a reality in the culture at large. Asians are quiet, they're diminutive. For decades, Asian men were portrayed as asexual, not particularly desirable as a romantic partner, whereas Asian women were hypersexualized. And every one of us in our culture, we have to deal with that. So we have a relationship to that, right? But then we also have a relationship to who we are as human beings. And Ron Sakamoto is a great example of this guy Japanese Canadian kid growing up in Medicine Hat, prairie boy, and he becomes like one of the greatest music promoters in Canadian history. He worked with Shania Twain and the Guess Who and the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band and on and on and on. And it's hard to reconcile if you buy into the cultural inscriptions of who Asians are supposed to be, who Japanese are supposed to be, reconcile that with who Ron Sakamoto is, and that goes for anybody, right? So there's definitely inherent, I think, in any story like Forgiveness, or any story like Janie's book, or Alice's book, there's complex relationships, because the reader obviously has a relationship too. We have our own assumptions that we're bringing to the story, and that story and those characters, to the extent that they subvert what we already believe about Asian people, right? That creates complexities, which you either find delicious and delightful, or some people can't deal with it. But that's, I think one of the great things about fiction and literature is that it does allow us to these windows into things that we never knew about before.
Thanks, Hiro. So, Alice, this whole thing, part of it is with mythology. I'm not as familiar with Chinese mythology, but I'm thinking I've seen so many movies recently, like Thor.
I haven't seen that.
You haven't seen Thor? Did you see Shang-Chi?
Yes.
Okay, Shang-Chi, which plays and riffs on some of these Chinese myths and legends.
Yes.
Even Bruce Lee is a legend in his own right. And the mythology of Bruce Lee, but the mythology of your characters, how do you relate to that, and why do you love it?
I don't know. As a child, I have loved. I loved mythology classics like Journey to the West, and when I grew older, I read Investiture of the Gods, and it all provides a sort of a wild world in which I can lose myself.
Yes, and Journey to the West features the story of the Monkey King traveling westward to India to bring Buddhism back to China.
Yes.
Who do we have? We have an author up in Edmonton, Marty Chan, who wrote about the Monkey King coming to Gamsan. Yeah, coming to the far west.
Yeah.
But how would you relate those characters together? The Monkey King inspired you in different ways.
Well, the Monkey King does appear in the story, but he only plays a small part. But there is a retelling of a very popular mythical folklore in the story, and that involves Neja and the Green Dragon. Neja, I think there is an animation film recently that features him. And this story is about how he got into very violent conflicts with this green dragon, and there is a retelling of this folklore in the story. Yeah, I think the story is very interesting.
Yes, I've been learning because I grew up here in North America. I didn't learn a lot growing up about Chinese mythology because my parents wanted us to be Canadianized. But learning about that and about the dragons, which are technically perhaps the bones of dragons. When if you go to the Sun Yat-sen Garden, they said that the mountain ranges are all the bones of dragons. Makes it interesting. So, Janie, do you have a question for one of our panelists before we get to questions from the audience?
Well, I have a comment for emerging writers, and then I have a question for Hiro.
Mhm.
So my comment is that if you're writing fiction, we're always told that characters have an arc. They end up being different people from who they are. So when you're writing, you need to be careful that when your characters are in a relationship and they are each going through their character arcs, you need to recognize that it means that their relationship to each other can also change. So just to be aware of that. Okay. And okay, so for Hiro, I have seen his face in like most of my favorite science fiction shows. But where I really geeked out was learning that he was story editor for hands down the best crime show set in Vancouver, Intelligence. And that was full of complex relationships. And it was a completely different setting and a different kind of family than the Sakamoto story. And I'm just wondering, where do you go to find those complex relationships? Is there a point at which you say, here's the situation for the characters, and aha, I know what I need to do with them?
Hmm. I don't know what I one thing that I feel blessed with is that whenever I have a really gnarly writing problem that I'm struggling with, I go to sleep and I wake up 3:30, 4 in the morning with the problem solved. So essentially what it is that once my ego and my conscious brain get out of the way, something in my subconscious, solves it for me. And there are entire scenes in Forgiveness that 3:30 in the morning I woke up and I keep a notepad and a pen. I just wake up and I just transcribe, essentially, is what I'm doing. It just comes from the ether. Transcribe, go to sleep.
Does this make it a
And
complicated relationship
No.
for your wife?
No, she doesn't. And then in the morning when I wake up, I have to, first thing I do, I get up and I type it in. Because if I left it a few hours, I'd never be able to read
Mhm.
the scrolls, But a lot of it is gold. Like, as I say, there's probably entire scenes in Forgiveness with very little revision and editing were things that came to me when I was asleep. So, when people say, "Oh, Hiro, the play did so well, you must be so proud of it," and I go, "Yeah, but you know what? Part of me feels like I didn't actually do it because it happened in my sleep."
Yeah.
So getting back to your question, there's
Not envious at all of your ability to come up with stuff in your sleep.
but as you say, like it's all family, and I think family dynamics are essentially similar regardless of what the universe, the milieu is.
Mhm.
And really, I think the more fantastical a universe is, it's more successful when we can still recognize the human relationships, that we're familiar with in our own lives. So even if it's Star Wars or whatever, I mean, Star Wars hinges on, Luke, I am your father, right? It's the most fantastical universe in the world, in our, but we can relate to it because we understand that family dynamic, right? So, yeah, I think that's how I would answer that.
Great.
Question.
Do you have a question
Have
for?
I answered it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have a question for Janie or Anne?
I have a question
Angela.
for Hiro and Janie. Which one of these give you the most inspiration? Books, films, or your real life experiences when writing relationships?
Someone said that all fiction is basically memoir, and it doesn't matter how hard I try and write characters that are different from me. I think your subconscious takes over at some point. And in many of the scenarios of the young women that I write, I see someone who is sort of standing with a foot in two cultures, or at a time of great political or social transition, where you're trying to negotiate a time of change, where you're being pulled into the traditional, and yet you know enough to know that there's something else out there where you can be more free, where you can be more yourself, where you can achieve your ambitions, and that need to sort of placate and be the stereotypical good Asian Canadian, versus the person that you could be, someone who's going to be more assertive at work, for example. And some of it actually is perpetrated by our own families, because there were so many times growing up when I felt as though what my father wanted from me was some kind of a well-balanced form of schizophrenia, where, outside the home, I was going to be successful and Canadian and get good grades and, do well in a career. And then come in through the door and I am the obedient, dutiful Chinese daughter, So, and much as I try, it turns out that these elements just keep finding their way into the characters I write. That subconscious thing, darn it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I take my inspiration from a very, I think unusual, people would find unusual, but when I was 14, I was living in Tokyo. I went to high school in Tokyo, and because I had grown up in the West, in Ontario and in the U.S., I was homesick for that. And there was a radio station out of the U.S. Army base, Yokosuka, and I would listen to that radio station because they would have top 40 and etc. And one night I was listening to it, and they played this new album that had just come out, Bruce Springsteen's "Darkness on the Edge of Town," and it terrorized me. Because I'd been listening to like Fleetwood Mac and Queen and Billy Joel and like rock, but kind of like not emotionally particularly challenging. And so Darkness on the Edge of Town, like I actually went out and bought it, and then for the next 3 weeks I tried to sell it because it was just so it terrified me. Just the intensity of it, and now of course it's my favorite album of all time, and I think it's one of the greatest albums of all time, and I think it's Springsteen's greatest album. There's no hits on it. The previous album, Born to Run, of course, is famous. And then the subsequent album, The River, has tons of hits on it. But Darkness on the Edge of Town is dark. It's very dark. It came at a time in his life when he was fighting lawsuits to gain control of his own career and so on. It's dark. And for the rest of my life, I think as an artist, my main aspiration is to make something that grabs the audience in the same way that that grabbed me, you know, which is I want to impact the audience on an emotional level in that same way. And the phrase from Yeats's poem, a terrible beauty comes to mind. And it's a biblical phrase from the Song of Solomon, you know, terrible as an army with banners. The idea of a beauty that is also terrible, that's terrifying, right?
Yes, and from the Bible, I'm thinking Springsteen's song, Adam Raised a Cain.
That's from Darkness on the Edge of Town.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm, every time I set out to create something, I want to affect the audience in that same way. I don't want to try and make you all go out and buy Darkness on the Edge of Town or listen to it. You know, it's not for everybody, but that's something that resonated with me and which has kind of been like a North Star. I aspire to that.
Cool. Okay, we've got 6 minutes left. Anybody want to ask a question?
Ooh, right.
We're going to repeat it. Wayne.
Hey, thank you. This is great. Sort of walking late, but I'm really happy to say that we're consumers of all three of your work and fans of yours. You talked about what you want to give to the audience, Hiro, and Janie, you talked about.
Oh, we're not getting it picked up by the mics, are we?
A little bit, but that's okay. If you just
Okay.
kind of rehash it.
I have to rehash this. Keep it short.
Okay, so I just want to know, like, your work is one of the few stories that represents the stories of, I think it's 140,000 Chinese laborers. And Hiro, your story, it's so weighty, it's personal. You know, there had to have been some emotional investment on your part. So I want to know, you're crafting this work. What did it do to you? And how did it impact you personally? Because, you're just not making up 3 characters or X number of characters. Or maybe I'm making an assumption that you're representing a much wider diaspora or many voices. Is there any pressure?
So the question is, there were so many characters in your work. How did it take a toll on you? How was the impression? How did it change you?
I think that despite the horror of World War II on both sides, suffered by the Sakamoto family and the McLean family, the story is ultimately a hopeful one. And because I was embraced throughout the process by the Sakamoto family, it was ultimately a really life-affirming experience for me. Just the fact that these people could live through such horror and tribulation and come out with grace and forgiveness in their hearts, And then on a larger level, it was kind of a real opportunity for me to connect with the Japanese Canadian community in a way that I hadn't prior to that. So it was not a dark experience for me in the least.
I would say that the research for Porcelain Moon and the book before that, The Library of Legends, was really, really hard because they were set in World War I and World War II around Chinese experiences. And war is like brutal. And I can definitely understand, why people get really depressed. Having said that, what I found has been really, really affirming are the number of people who write to me saying, I'm Asian, I'm Chinese Canadian, Chinese American, and I had no idea about this part of history. And thank you for bringing it to light. Or even with the Library of Legends, which was based on my father's experience of evacuating his university from Nanjing into central China. When the Japanese invaded, people just outside of China had no idea of that history. So even though the research can be really brutal, the reward comes when I get those emails to say, I had no idea. Nobody ever taught this to us in school, because it's a very Eurocentric, North American centric kind of a school system that we have. And the book that I'm writing right now is going to be really lighthearted. It's Gothic. It's going to be a Gothic novel set in pre-war Shanghai, and there's not going to be any world wars or death and destruction or anything like that.
Great. Alice, do you have a comment or no?
No.
Do we have one last question from the audience? Going 5, 4, 3, 2, what? No, sorry. Anybody else want to wrap it up? We've said all we can. This has been amazing. Thank you all for coming today. Word on the street. Well, it's not longer Word on the Street, it's Word Vancouver. And we're really glad to have you all here today. And we'll feature you at Literation maybe too. Or you have been there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the audience and being so attentive and laughing at our bad jokes. Incredible insight with the complex relationships. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Todd.